or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Eric Jackson, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the June 30th issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our first article is by Theodore Schaeffler, Kenneth P. Vogel, and Shane Goldmacher. It's titled, Biden's Debate Breeds Doubt in Donor Class. The Democratic Party's perennially nervous donor class descended into deep unease on Friday, as some of the wealthiest people in America commiserated over President Biden's weak debate performance and puzzled over what, if anything, they could do to change the course of the race. There were discussions with political advisors about arcane rules under which Mr. Biden might be removed from the ticket against his will and replaced at or before the Democratic National Convention, according to a person familiar with the effort. In Silicon Valley, a group of megadonors, including Ron Conway and Lauren Powell Jobs, were calling, texting, and emailing one another about a situation they described as a possible catastrophe. The donors wondered about whom in the Biden fold they could contact to reach Jill Biden, the First Lady, who in turn could persuade her husband not to run, according to a person familiar with the conversations. A Silicon Valley donor who had planned to host an intimate fundraiser featuring Mr. Biden this summer decided not to go through with the gathering because of the debate, according to a person told directly by the prospective host. Another major California donor left a debate watch party early and emailed a friend with the subject line, "Utter disaster," according to a copy of the email. In group chats and hushed discussions, some wealthy Democrats floated interventions. Others hoped Mr. Biden would have an epiphany and decide to exit on his own. But still more strategized about steering dollars to down-ballot candidates. The most optimistic donors wanted to wait for polling to see the scope of the fallout. The crisis in the donor class, outlined in interviews with almost 24 donors and fundraisers, many of whom insisted on anonymity to discuss their private conversations, could not come at a worse moment for Mr. Biden. Former President Donald J. Trump outraised him in each of the last 2 months, erasing Mr. Biden's financial advantage and opening one of his own. By Friday evening, many donors were coming to terms with the unlikelihood of finding a viable alternative, even as some acknowledged diminished enthusiasm and grumbled about the Biden team's lack of communication to major fundraisers in the 24 hours after the debate. Compared with small online donors, major donors require more maintenance, but those personal relationships can yield big dividends in pivotal moments, like the one Mr. Biden is facing as he confronts a wave of worry for Democrats about his political strength. The donor class is being closely watched for signs of whether he can ride out the doubts. While the Biden campaign briefed some members of its National Finance Committee on Friday in Atlanta, other members were aghast that they had received almost zero outreach from campaign headquarters. Reid Hoffman, one of the Democratic Party's most influential donors, wrote in an email to friends on Friday evening that he had been inundated. "I got a lot of emails in the last 24 hours asking whether there should be a public campaign to pressure President Biden to step aside after his very bad debate performance last night," he wrote in the email, which was seen by the New York Times. It certainly delivered a blow to the mood among donors and organizers. Cash is a sudden priority for the Biden campaign. After opening a $100 million advantage over Mr. Trump a couple of months ago, the Biden campaign and the Democratic National Committee entered June with $212 million in the bank, compared with $235 million for the Trump operation and the Republican National Committee. The Biden campaign had hoped to close the gap through a push in the 72 hours after the debate. The scramble coincided with the typically lucrative end of the second quarter filing period, when campaigns rush to raise cash and project momentum. Mr. Biden's team planned fundraisers on Friday and over the weekend featuring the President and the First Lady, as well as Vice President Kamala Harris and celebrities in wealthy enclaves, including Manhattan, the Hamptons, and Park City, Utah. If nothing else, the shaky debate performance cast a shadow over those events and led to concerns about diminished hauls. The Biden campaign pushed back on any financial concerns, announcing that from Thursday into Friday morning it had raised $14 million in online donations, which are typically smaller than those from major donors. The hour after the debate, from 11 p.m. to midnight, was the single best hour of Mr. Biden's campaign, the campaign said. The grumbling and strategizing by major donors played out in a rolling series of conference calls, text debates, and signal chats that started soon after Mr. Biden opened his mouth on stage at Atlanta on Thursday evening, and continued until late on Friday. Some described the communications in tones that resembled a virtual group therapy session. "This is an immediate response to a disappointment," said Craig Kaplan, a lawyer and major Democratic donor in New York. During a weekly Friday morning Zoom call with major New York donors, Mr. Kaplan urged participants to prioritize giving to congressional and state races. "The importance of the down ballot is heightened," he said in an interview, "by the perception of weakness at the top of the ticket." He added that he did not intend to abandon Mr. Biden. Stephen Kozin, a Democratic donor who considers the president a friend, said he had tried to talk down donors who were urging a Biden intervention. He deserves the opportunity to reflect and say, "I still think I can do this. I still think that I am the best choice." Or to conclude that he's not the best option, Mr. Kozin said, recounting his counsel. "And that's his decision. And I'll stick with him until he makes it." In the upper crust of democratic society, there was a gap between public and private communications. Publicly, few were willing to brook any criticism of the president. But privately, major donors were pondering matters that seemed like fan fiction just days ago, wondering to one another about which party elder, Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, might have the political juice to persuade Mr. Biden to stand down. And as they debated which Democrat might be the best to replace Mr. Biden, with Governors Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan and Gavin Newsom of California among the more popular prospects. Some donors argued that the debate's significance was being exaggerated. "He had a poor performance," said Robert Wolf, the former chairman of UBS Americas. "But a 90-minute debate doesn't offset 3.5 years of his presidency. So I'll be in there fighting for Biden." Chris Korge, the financial chairman of the Biden Victory Fund, said that now is the time we put our head down and fight as hard as we can, he added. Donors will never quit on Biden. Mr. Hoffman, effectively the leader of the Silicon Valley Democrats, said that he believed it was a mistake to pressure Mr. Biden, in part, because it wouldn't work. "Joe is our nominee. Any decision to step aside is up to him and his family, period. If anything, a public effort might compel the Bidens to try and prove the doubters wrong." Biden fundraisers were hearing from plenty of people, but precious little from the campaign itself. On Thursday, around noon, members of the Biden Financial Brain Trust descended on Atlanta for what was expected to be a valedictorian gathering, the summer meeting of the several hundred-strong National Finance Committee. Fundraisers at the Atlanta Ritz-Carlton were treated to presentations on campaign tactics and issues according to materials distributed to donors in advance, plus a debate debrief. But many members of the Finance Committee, away on vacation, deterred by the inability to attend the audience-free debate, or unable to make it on short notice, skipped the meeting altogether. Meanwhile, the Bidens tried to project normalcy to the donors. On Friday afternoon, Jill Biden was in New York for a reception titled Writers, Wit, and Wisdom, while Miss Harris was in Park City for her own high-dollar event. Mark Gilbert, a Democratic fundraiser who hosted her in Park City, said the debate had not dampened enthusiasm. "Not only were there no cancellations, we received numerous calls asking if it were too late to attend," Mr. Gilbert said. Mr. Biden himself appeared on Friday in Manhattan with Elton John at the Stonewall Inn, followed by an LGBTQ-focused fundraiser at the Hammerstein Ballroom at Manhattan Center. On Saturday, he was set to travel to the Hamptons for an event at the home of the billionaire, Barry Rosenstein, who said that he was preparing for more than 200 attendees, which is more than double of his expectations. Later on Saturday, Mr. Biden was scheduled to attend a fundraiser at the home of Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey. Biden's fundraising at the end of Pride Month is chock full of cameos from celebrities and those with ties to the LGBTQ movement, including a garden party on Saturday in Los Angeles featuring a performance from Idina Menzel. Still, Friday ended without a clear sense of what donors could do about Mr. Biden. The best that some could muster was gallows humor, a meme, a gif, or a sense that things could always be worse. "No one's bailing," said Steve Phillips, a prominent Democratic donor in California. Everyone's resigned to this situation. Our next article is by Coral Davenport, and it's titled "Justices' Ruling Sharply Curtail EPA Authority." A spate of decisions over the past 2 years by the Supreme Court has significantly impaired the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to limit pollution in the air and water, regulate the use of toxic chemicals, and reduce the greenhouse gases that are heating our planet. This term, the court's conservative supermajority handed down several rulings that chip away at the power of many federal agencies. But the Environmental Agency has been under particular fire, the result of a series of cases brought since 2022 by conservative activists who say that the EPA regulations have driven up costs for industries ranging from electric utilities to home building. Those arguments have resonated among justices skeptical of government regulation. On Friday, the court ended the use of what is known as the Chevron Doctrine, a cornerstone of administrative law for 40 years that said that courts should defer to government agencies to interpret unclear laws. That decision threatens the authority of many federal agencies to regulate the environment and also healthcare, workplace safety, telecommunications, the financial sector, and more. But more remarkable have been the several decisions by the court to intervene to stop environmental regulations before they were decided by lower courts or even before they were implemented by the executive branch. On Thursday, the court said that the EPA could not limit smokestack pollution that blows across state borders under a measure known as the Good Neighbor Rule. In that case, the court took the surprising step of weighing in while litigation was still pending at the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. The court also acted as an unusually preliminary fashion last year when it struck down a proposed EPA rule known as the Waters of the United States that was designed to protect millions of acres of wetlands from pollution, acting before the regulation had ever even been made final. Similarly, in a 2022 challenge to an EPA climate proposal known as the Clean Power Plan, the court sharply limited the agency's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, even though that rule had not yet taken effect. That kind of intervention has little in the way of precedent. Usually, the Supreme Court is the last venue to hear a case, after arguments have been made and opinions have been rendered by lower courts. This court has shown an interest in making law in this area, in not having the patience to wait for cases to first come up through the courts, said Kevin Minoli, a lawyer who worked in the EPA's Office of General Counsel from the Clintons through the Trump administrations. They've been aggressive on ruling. It's like, we're going to tell you the answer before you even ask the question. Collectively, those decisions now not only endanger many existing environmental rules, but may prevent future administrations from writing new ones, experts say. These are among the worst environmental law rulings that the Supreme Court will ever issue, said Ian Fine, a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council, an advocacy group. They all cut sharply against the federal government's ability to enforce laws that protect us from polluters. The march of environmental cases is not over. The court has agreed to hear a case next term that could limit the reach of the National Environmental Policy Act, the 1970 law that requires federal agencies to analyze whether their proposed projects have environmental consequences. Businesses and industries have long complained that the reviews can take years, inflate costs, and be used by community groups to block projects. For a coalition of industries, conservative advocacy groups, and Republican attorney generals and their campaign donors, the recent decisions are a victory in a multi-year strategy to use the judicial system to influence environmental policy. Many of the petitioners on the cases overlap, including the Republican Attorney General from at least 18 states, the National Mining Association, the American Petroleum Institute, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The lead plaintiff on last year's wetlands protection case, The Pacific Legal Foundation is part of the network of conservative research organizations that have received funding from the billionaire Charles Koch, who is chairman of the petrochemical company Koch Industries and a champion of anti-regulatory cases. And I just want to take a moment here to remind you that you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And to continue. You see much more coordination now than you used to. Coalitions of states and trade groups to change administrative law, said Damian M. Schiff, a lawyer at the Pacific Legal Foundation. Trade groups, the Chamber, PLF, we very consciously take cases that we hope will win in a precedent-setting way. The strategy, the tactics are the same. It's coordinated internally. The Supreme Court has shown a greater willingness to exercise its authority earlier in the litigation process, Mr. Schiff said. The plaintiffs are also strategizing for the future. President Biden has pledged that the United States will cut its carbon dioxide pollution in half by 2030 and eliminate it by 2050, which scientists say all major economies must do if the world is to avoid the most deadly and costly impacts of climate change. This year, the EPA has rushed to finalize new rules to slash pollution from cars, trucks, power plants, and methane leaks from oil and gas wells. If he wins a second term, Mr. Biden wants to cut emissions from steel, cement, and other heavy industries that have never been required to reduce their planet-warming emissions. But the string of recent losses before the Supreme Court could make it difficult for the EPA to follow through on those plans. There's been a steady erosion of environmental law, said Patrick Parenteau, an expert on environmental law at the Vermont Law School. These decisions mean that Biden, if he gets a second term, is not going to be able to do much else on the environment, particularly on climate. Christine Todd Whitman, a one-time Republican and former governor of New Jersey who served as the administrator of the EPA during the George W. Bush administration, said that the environmental regulations sometimes could go too far and needed to be tempered by courts. But she said she saw the Supreme Court's recent decisions as an alarming new precedent. What this activist conservative court is now doing, which really upsets me, is trying to implement a political agenda, Ms. Whitman said. They are looking for an opportunity to make a statement, and it circumvents and undermines the agencies. It's as if they take the attitude that it's all regulations are bad, and we're going to stop them all before they go too far. And that will have harmful consequences, she says. If you don't have clean air to breathe and water to drink, it's going to cost a lot, Ms. Whitman said. This is putting a lot of people's lives in jeopardy. For example, the court's decision to curtail the EPA's authority to regulate wetlands and so-called ephemeral streams means that about half of the nation's wetlands could be polluted or paved without federal penalty, potentially harming thousands of species of plants and animals. In addition, new research has shown that the court's decision also makes major American river basins vulnerable to pollution. Carrie Severino, president of the Judicial Crisis Network, said in a statement that the legal decisions properly shift authority over decisions with great economic impact from the executive to the legislative branch. For too long, unaccountable bureaucrats in D.C. have been imposing destructive regulations that harm farmers, fishermen, and countless small business owners who are already struggling to survive in our global economy. And the Supreme Court has an opportunity to restore accountability to that process by putting power back in the hands of Congress where it belongs. On that last point, environmentalists and conservatives say that they agree. If the federal government wants to protect the environment, then Congress should update existing laws and pass new legislation. The nation's bedrock environmental laws, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, were both written more than 50 years ago. Since then, Congress has passed one major law to address climate change, the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. It includes more than $370 billion in incentives for clean energy technologies, including wind and solar power and electric vehicles. Climate experts call it a strong first step in cutting the nation's emissions, but say that far more is needed to eliminate them entirely in the next 25 years. The agencies for more than 30 years have needed to use old, existing laws to deal with new environmental problems, said Michael Girard, director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University. And this new court is now making that extraordinarily difficult. Unless Congress is extremely specific, agencies can't act. But since Congress is largely immobilized, this in turn freezes what they can do. Our next article is by Dave Phillips, and it's titled, Navy SEALs Lost to Suicide Share a Pattern of Brain Damage. David Metcalf's last act in life was an attempt to send a message that years as a Navy SEAL had left his brain so damaged that he could barely recognize himself. He died by suicide in his garage in North Carolina in 2019, after nearly 20 years in the Navy. But just before he died, he arranged a stack of books about brain injury by his side and taped a note to the door that read, in part, gaps in memory, failing recognition, mood swings, headaches, impulsiveness, fatigue, anxiety, and paranoia were not who I was, but have become who I am. Each is worsening. Then he shot himself in the heart, preserving his brain to be analyzed by state-of-the-art Defense Department laboratory in Maryland. The lab found an unusual pattern of damage seen only in people exposed repeatedly to blast waves. The vast majority of blast exposure for Navy SEALs comes from the firing of their own weapons, not from enemy action. The damage pattern suggested that years of training intended to make SEALs exceptional was leaving some barely able to function. But the message that Lieutenant Metcalf sent never got through to the Navy. No one at the lab told the SEAL leadership what the analysts had found, and the leadership never asked. And it wasn't the first time, nor the last. At least a dozen Navy SEALs have died by suicide in the last 10 years, either while in the military or shortly after leaving. A grassroots effort by the grieving families delivered 8 of their brains to the lab, an investigation by the New York Times has found. And after careful analysis, researchers have discovered that blast damage in every single one of them. It's a stunning pattern, with important implications for how SEALs train and fight. But privacy guidelines at the lab and poor communication in the military bureaucracy kept the test results hidden. 5 years after Lieutenant Metcalf's death, Navy leaders still didn't know. Until the Times told the Navy of the lab's findings about the SEALs who died by suicide, the Navy had not been informed, the service confirmed in a statement. A Navy officer close to the SEAL leadership expressed audible shock and then frustration when told about the findings by the Times. And that's the problem, said the officer, who asked not to be named in order to discuss a sensitive topic. We're trying to understand this issue, but so often the information never even reaches us. The lack of communication has led Navy leaders to overlook a potentially critical threat to its elite special operators. When the commander of SEAL Team 1 died by suicide in 2022, SEAL leaders responded by ceasing nearly all operations for a day so the force could learn about suicide prevention. According to 4 people with knowledge of the commander's case, his brain was later found to have extensive blast damage, but because the leaders were not told, they never discussed the threat of blast exposure with the force. Evidence suggests that the damage may be just as widespread in SEALs who are still alive. A Harvard study, published this spring, scanned the brains of 30 career special operators and found altered brain structures and compromised brain function in nearly all of them. The more blast exposure the men had experienced, the more problems they reported with health and quality of life. That study was funded by Special Operations Command, which has been at the forefront of the military's effort to understand the issue. In December, the study's main author briefed the command's top leaders, including from the Navy SEALs. We have a moral obligation to protect the cognitive health and combat effectiveness of our teammates, Rear Admiral Keith Davids, the commander of Navy Special Warfare, which include the SEALs, said in the statement. He said the Navy is trying to limit brain injuries by limiting blast exposure and is actively participating in medical research designed to enhance understanding in this critical field. But without the data on suicides, a key piece of the problem was never discussed at the briefing. Blows to the head. The communication breakdown is part of a broader disconnect in the Defense Department, which spends nearly $1 billion each year on brain injury research and many billions more to train and equip troops, but does comparatively little to ensure that the latest science on brain injuries informs practices in the ranks. Lieutenant Metcalf's wife, Jamie Metcalf, said in an interview that she had come to see his death as an effort to draw attention to a widespread problem. He left an intentional message because he knew that things had to change, she said. When told the information about his brain had not reached the SEAL leadership, she sighed and said, "You have to be kidding me." The military readily acknowledges that traumatic brain injury is the most common injury from recent conflicts. But it is struggling to understand how many of those injuries are inflicted by the shock waves unleashed by the troops' own triggers. There are signs that the damage can come from a wide array of weapons. Artillery crew members who fired thousands of rounds in combat came home plagued by hallucinations and psychosis. Mortar teams suffered from headaches and deteriorating memory. Reliable soldiers suddenly turned violent and murdered neighbors after years of working around blasts from tanks and grenades in combat or in training. Blast waves may kill brain cells without causing any immediate noticeable symptoms, according to Dr. Daniel Daneshvar, Chief of Brain Injury Rehabilitation at Harvard Medical School. People may be getting injured without even realizing it, Dan Daneshvar said, but over time it adds up. People's brains can often compensate until injuries accumulate to a critical level, he said, and then people kind of fall off a cliff. In many cases, doctors treating the injured troops give them diagnosis of psychiatric disorders that miss the underlying physical damage. Much of what is categorized as post-traumatic stress disorder may actually be caused by repeated exposure to blasts. The stories of the SEALs who died by suicide point to a troubling pattern in the elite force. Their average age was 43. Each had deployed to combat a number of times, but none had been wounded by enemy fire. All had spent years firing a wide arsenal of powerful weapons, jumping from airplanes, blowing open doors with explosives, diving deep underwater, and learning to fight hand-to-hand. Over the years, they had developed the expertise and sharp judgment of seasoned special operators. But late in their careers, the effects of years of repeated blast exposure ate those skills away from them. Around the age of 40, nearly all of them started to struggle with insomnia and headaches, memory and coordination problems, depression, confusion, and sometimes rage. The first thing people think is it must be PTSD. But that never made sense to me. It didn't fit, said Jennifer Collins, whose husband, retired Chief Petty Officer David Collins, was a SEAL for 20 years and died in 2014, just over a year after leaving the Navy. A late career breakdown. Miss Collins is the reason that the brains of a high proportion of the SEALs who have died by suicide made it to the Defense Department's lab. Her husband was in many ways a typical SEAL member. Smart, confident, easygoing, and high-achieving. He deployed to Afghanistan twice and Iraq 3 times, and when he was not deployed, he was away from home for 100 of days each year in training. Combat never seemed to faze Mr. Collins, but near the end of his Navy career, he started to change in subtle ways that Miss Collins pieced together only in retrospect. He began to avoid social gatherings. He struggled to sleep. He started to make strange, obsessive family schedules and become irritated when they were not followed. Some simple chores, like raking leaves into a tarp, started to confound him. He would step out the door to go to work, realize he'd forgotten his keys, go back inside to get them, and then forget why he had returned. All were signs of brain injury. But at the time, the military generally associated brain injury with big blasts from the roadside bombs, something Mr. Collins had never experienced. And no one was telling the troops that repeated exposure to routine blasts from their own weapons might be a risk. Mr. Collins' mental health took a sudden plunge when he was 45. He had left the Navy and started a civilian job teaching troops to operate small drones. One morning, well before the sun was up, he called his wife in a panic from a work trip, saying that he had forgotten how to do his job and hadn't slept in 4 days. He was super anxious, almost paranoid, Miss Collins recalled. He was nothing like my husband. When Mr. Collins returned to the couple's home in Virginia Beach, doctors scanned his brain with magnetic resonance imaging but found nothing abnormal. They eventually gave him a diagnosis of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, and prescribed a number of drugs for sleep and mood. They didn't help. He then went to a specialty clinic for brain injury, but failed to find relief there as well. Everyday tasks like booking a flight became so arduous that he would puzzle over them for hours. He was sleepless and agitated, scared that his mind was slipping away. In March of 2014, 3 months after placing a frantic pre-dawn call to his wife, he went to return a few library books, dropped off a tuition check at his son's kindergarten, and then drove to a secluded side street. He sent a text to his wife saying, "So sorry, baby. I love you all," and ended his life. I knew, with all that he had been going through, that text could only mean one thing, Miss Collins said. When the police came to the house to confirm his death, she was adrift in grief and confusion. But one determined thought floated from the front of her mind. I told the police, and I was adamant, that I wanted his brain donated to research, she recalled. I wanted to try and find some answers. Just as a moment, I wanted to remind you that you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And to continue with the next section, which is Visible Under a Microscope. In Bethesda, Maryland, the Defense Department built a lab in 2012 called the Department of Defense Brain Tissue Repository, whose goal was to gather the brains of deceased veterans to look for clues to the two most widespread injuries in recent wars, PTSD and traumatic brain injury. But 2 years after opening, the lab faced a fundamental problem. It had no brains to study. The lab depended on tissue donations from the family of war veterans who had recently died, but few families knew that it existed, and the lab's bylaws barred it from cold calling grieving families to ask. Brain tissue deteriorates quickly. By the time that most families found out about the lab, it was too late. Miss Collins' quick decisions meant that her husband's brain was soon packed in ice and on its way. That single brain revealed a pattern of damage that the head of the lab, Dr. Daniel Pearl, who had spent a career studying neuropathy in civilians, had never seen before. Nearly everywhere that the tissues of different density or stiffness met, there was a border of scar tissue, a shoreline of damage that seemed to have been caused by the repeated crash of blast waves. It was not chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which is found in football players and other athletes who have been repeatedly hit in the head. It was something new. The lab's research team started looking for similar damage in other brains. In civilians' brains, they didn't find it. Nor was it in the brains of veterans who had been exposed to a single powerful explosion like a roadside bomb. But in veterans exposed repeatedly to blasts, they found it again and again. The team published a landmark study in 2016 reporting the pattern of microscopic damage, which they called interface astroglial scarring. And for the first time, we could actually see the injury, Dr. Pearl said in an interview. If you know what the problem is, then you can start to design solutions. Dr. Pearl said privacy rules bar him from discussing specific cases, but members of the families who provided brains to study said that the lab found interface astroglial scarring in 6 of the 8 SEALs who died by suicide. The other 2 SEALs, including Lieutenant Metcalf, had a different type of damage in the same blast-affected areas. Star-shaped helper cells, called astrocytes in the brain, appeared to have been repeatedly injured and had grown into gargantuan, tangled masses that barely functioned. The lab plans to publish findings on the astrocyte injuries soon. Recent studies suggest that damage is caused when energy waves surging through the brain bounce off of the tissue boundaries like an echo, and for the few fractions of a millisecond, create a vacuum that causes nearby liquid in the brain to explode into bubbles of vapor. Those tiny explosions are violent enough to blow brain cells apart in a process known as cavitation. Dr. Pearl shared with Miss Collins what he had found in her husband's brain in 2016, and she made it her mission to get more families to donate. Spreading the word. For the next several years, Miss Collins told anyone who would listen about his case. Navy SEAL leaders, veterans groups, gatherings of wives, and when a career SEAL died by suicide, a call from Miss Collins often soon followed. In 2017, she called the parents of Special Operator First Class Ryan Larkin. A few months later, she sat down with the wife of retired Chief Petty Officer Bill Mulder. She had the paperwork in her hand and said, "I think this would be a smart thing to do," Mr. Mulder's wife, Sydney Mulder, recalled in an interview. "I was in a blur, but I didn't hesitate, and I'm glad that I did it." Miss Collins's influence spread until brain donations became somewhat common for special operations troops. But little of what the researchers have learned from those brains made it back to the SEAL team leadership. Mr. Mulder, like Mr. Collins, had spent a career in the SEALs, but had never been wounded. He was an explosives expert in the elite SEAL Team 6, exposed to thousands of blasts in training. And after years of steady service, he went into steep decline. He couldn't sleep and was constantly misplacing things. Frustration would send him into a rage. He stewed over negative interactions in his squadron and started drinking before work. For all of the years I'd known him, he had been such a capable man, Miss Mulder said. He'd wake up at 6 in the morning and get his work out. He was incredibly smart and organized and diligent. And then he just wasn't. And after years of trying to get help from doctors who largely overlooked the possibility of brain injury, Mr. Mulder took his own life at the age of 46. Jamie Metcalf also noticed a sudden decline in her husband when he returned from his 2018 tour in his 5th deployment. For years, Lieutenant Metcalf had been a high achiever. He was an enlisted SEAL sniper and taught martial arts to other SEALs. A few years before he died, he decided to pursue a military medical career, became an officer, and sailed through the demanding training program for physician's assistants. But after his final deployment, he was moody, confused, and plagued by headaches. He put wet laundry in the dryer on top of dry clothes. One day, he emptied out the kitchen cupboards to organize them, and then left everything lying in piles on the counter. It was so unlike him. He had always been so organized, Miss Metcalf said. Now I know that he was afraid there was something happening in his brain. But at the time, I think he tried to hide it. He died a few months later at age 42. The men who died by suicide represent only a small fraction of the career SEALs with brain injuries after the years around blasts. Several SEAL veterans said in interviews that many of their former teammates are now divorced and grappling with depression, paranoia, and substance abuse, all of which can be caused by deteriorating brain function. Desperate calls from suicidal friends are common, they said. Miss Metcalf saw how broad the problem was when she read the letter her husband had left about his brain injury symptoms to 2 of his SEAL friends. One of them was crying in my lap, saying, "That's me. That's me," she said. And the other told me that a lot of them have problems, and they don't know what to do. Our next article is by Andrew E. Kramer and Maria Verenikova. It's titled "Motorcycles, Not Tanks, is a Methodical Russian Advance." They first appeared as a cloud of dust on the horizon. A few seconds later, the motorcycles carrying Russian soldiers sped into view, zigzagging across a field and kicking up dust, attempting a noisy, dangerous run at a Ukrainian trench. They moved fast, they spread out, and they swerved, said Lieutenant Mikhailo Hubitsky, describing the Russian motorcycle assault that he witnessed. It's a type of attack that has been proliferating along the front line this spring, adding a wild new element to the already violent, chaotic fighting. Russian soldiers riding motorcycles, dirt bikes, quadricycles, and doom buggies now account for about half of all attacks in the areas in the front, soldiers and commanders say, as Moscow's forces attempt to use speed to cross exposed spaces where its lumbering armored vehicles are easy targets. These non-conventional vehicles have been turning up with such frequency that some Ukrainian trenches now overlook junkyards of abandoned, blown-up off-road vehicles, videos from reconnaissance drones show. The new tactic is the latest Russian adaptation for a heavily mined, continually surveilled battlefield as Moscow's forces work to achieve a small tactical gains, often of just a few hundred yards. The Russians' farthest advances in the region is 15 miles from its starting point. "We're fighting a war over every meter," said Captain Yaroslav, an artillery commander with the 80th Air Assault Brigade, who earlier this week was firing rockets towards Russian lines. He provided only his first name for security reasons. Russia, nevertheless, remains the army of the offensive. Over time, its gains have added up, and the Russian military is now close to strategically important supply lines and towns in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. Since capturing the city of Bakhmut in May of 2023, a Russian offensive to the west advanced about 3 miles over more than a year. It is now stalled at a water canal near the town of Chasiv Yar. But now the Russians are threatening to flank Ukrainian positions there, while also approaching a key Ukrainian supply line, and I'm going to butcher this name, I apologize, the Pokrovsk, Kostyantyk-Nivka Highway. Again, my apologies, that's a tough one. The risk to this supply route adds new urgency to the fighting that has been on this section of the front. If the Russians take control of that road, or even threaten it, it would slow the flow of food, weapons, and ammunition to the Ukrainian army, which they need to fight in the Donbas. On Monday, 2 Russian missiles narrowly missed a key bridge on the highway. The strike left the bridge intact, but resulted in fatalities and injuries, regional authorities have stated. Beyond that, the Russian advance also threatens 2 Ukrainian-held towns, Toretsk and New York, the latter a small dot on the Ukrainian plains that took the name in the 19th century. If these towns fall, then Russia would be poised to press on towards the largest remaining Ukrainian-held cities in the region: Kostyantynivka, Druzhkivka, and Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk. Again, apologies. Authorities this month have stepped up evacuations of civilians from Toretsk and New York, removing the few remaining residents by vans amid heavy bombardment. Inside the partially encircled towns, Russian artillery bombardments echo through mostly deserted streets. Plumes of gray smoke rise from the strikes, and along nearly every block in New York is a small brick house with a roof that has been smashed in by an artillery shell. In the Donbas, every town Russia has captured since its full-scale invasion in 2022 has been bombed to ruins. The evacuations are done hastily, with residents just having a few minutes to load 1 or 2 bags into vans and then part from houses that they have occupied for lifetimes. Boom, boom, boom was how one evacuee, Alina Olyak, age 69, who's a retired nurse, described conditions in the town of Toretsk over the past week as the Russian army made incremental advances over the fields. "I say goodbye to my lovely city," Miss Olyak said. "The Russian army is now about a mile from the city center, and the van that evacuated Miss Olyak on Monday was destroyed on Tuesday by a spray of shrapnel from a Russian rocket, wounding one of the volunteers who had been carrying on evacuations." As its army advances, Russia has experimented with multiple approaches to crossing exposed fields. The latest is the assault with the motorcycles. With reconnaissance drones ubiquitous in the skies over Donbas, the armored vehicles of both armies are easy targets. The faster-moving motorcycles and buggies are harder to hit with artillery. The drawback is that they provide no protection for Russian soldiers who are exposed to a hail of machine gun fire as they approach the trenches. Sometimes, the bikers get through if Russian artillery bombardments succeed in preventing Ukrainian soldiers from poking their heads above the trench. The tactic solves, though at great risk, a key tactical challenge of the war in Ukraine for both sides: how to cross a mined open field while observed by drones and under artillery fire. If they make it across the field, the riders cast aside their bikes, enter the Ukrainian trench, and engage in close combat on foot. They jump off and start shooting, said a Ukrainian sergeant, Sapson, serving with the 47th Mechanized Brigade, who asked to be identified only by a nickname, which is in keeping with his unit's security protocols. "These buggies and motorcycles are fast, and they fly right into our tree lines." Like the wave of infantry assaults that Russia used to capture Bakhmut last year, the motorcycle assaults result in huge casualties, Ukrainian soldiers say. These attacks have not supplanted the Russian military's employing of its blunt advantage in numbers of artillery guns and quantities of ammunition to advance. It's an additional tactic. The use of cheap, disposable dirt bikes and buggies helps conserve Russian armored vehicles as the Russian military resorts to drawing on stockpiles of outdated tanks dating to the Cold War. The new motorcycle tactics are executed in tandem with another atypical form of attack that takes on an opposite strategy of going in bulky and slowly. Russians will weld sheet metal armor to tanks for protection against exploding drones, creating boxy structures the size of a house, known as a turtle tank. These gigantic, lumbering vehicles creak and crawl over the fields, and have become another bizarre sight turning up on the Donbas battlefields. On the fields, motorcycle riders have good visibility and can swerve to avoid mines that armored vehicle operators might not see. Or they ride along tracks left by armored vehicles in earlier assaults, knowing that these routes will be free of mines. I just want to take a moment to remind you that you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And to continue. But riders have no protection from artillery shrapnel exploding around them, and once they approach the Ukrainian trenches, they are exposed to a fusillade of machine gun fire. How they find people willing to do this, I don't know, said Volodymyr, a sergeant who also asked to be identified only by his first name, in keeping with the military protocol. Sometimes none of them will make it, sometimes all of them. Ukraine also counters the motorcycle assaults with exploding quadcopter drones steered by an operator wearing a virtual reality goggle, an improvised weapon that emerged in the war in Ukraine and has reshaped the battlefield for its ability to hit armored vehicles on the move. All of these obstacles can prove lethal, as was the case for the assault that Lieutenant Hubitsky witnessed when 8 or 9 dirt bike riders charged the Ukrainian trenches. Once the riders came into range, Ukrainian soldiers opened fire with machine guns, Lieutenant Hubitsky said. The swerving dirt bikes were hard targets. Some were hit, others not. But in that instance, too few Russians survived the ride to form an effective unit to storm the Ukrainian trench. The survivors, who abandoned their bikes at the edge of the field, were killed in close combat. That hasn't deterred Russian commanders from continuing to employ the tactic. All the tree lines, said Sapson, a sergeant in the 47th Brigade, are now full of these buggies and motorcycles. Our next article is by Alan Fuhrer, and it's titled, Supreme Court Ruling Reflects Challenges of January 6th Prosecutions. The Supreme Court's decision on Friday that prosecutors had misused an obstruction law in charging hundreds of rioters who attacked the Capitol is the latest example of the persistent challenges the Justice Department has faced in grappling with the consequences of January 6, 2021. By and large, the department has succeeded over the past 3 years in moving against members of the pro-Trump mob who sought to disrupt the certification of President Biden's victory on January 6th, and in winning convictions on seditious conspiracy charges against members of the 2 far-right groups that were instrumental in stoking the violence that day, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. But lacking any established legal blueprint for addressing an assault on the foundations of democracy, prosecutors sometimes got creative with the law. That has left them vulnerable to second-guessing by the courts and how they've pursued criminal cases, both against the rioters and against the former president, Donald J. Trump, and contributing to a long series of challenges and delays. The court's new ruling on the obstruction law will hardly cripple the Justice Department's ability to go after the rioters, but it will constrain prosecutors by restricting the use of an important tool that they have relied on to seek accountability against the most disruptive members of the mob. Within weeks of the Capitol being breached, Michael Sherwin, then the top federal prosecutor in Washington, promised to wage a campaign of shock and awe against the rioters who had attacked the building. Even though Mr. Sherwin said that sedition charges might be filed at some point against some of the defendants, his prosecutors end up leaning much more heavily on the obstruction statute to go after those who they believed had committed the central crime that day, interfering with the certification of the election, which was taking place at a joint session in Congress. Initially designed as a hedge against corporate malfeasance, the obstruction law was never an easy fit for addressing the chaos that erupted at the Capitol. And almost from the start, defense lawyers complained that the government had stretched the statute far beyond its meaning, accusing prosecutors of using it mostly because it carried a stiff maximum penalty of 20 years in prison. The Supreme Court largely agreed with all of this, narrowing the scope of the law and ruling that it could be used only in cases hewing more closely to its original intent, where documents had been originally tampered with or where other forms of evidence had been damaged or impaired. With their ruling, the justices effectively ratified the argument that the Justice Department had seized on the breadth and vagueness of the statute and improperly twisted it to fit the circumstances of events on January 6th. The court has affirmed the common-sense notion that a citizen obstructs justice only by impairing evidence, said Nicholas Smith, a lawyer that was part of the early push against the way the Justice Department was using the laws. It rejects again attempts by clever prosecutors to riff on equivocal language. Many of the charges that January 6th defendants have faced have been fairly straightforward. Those who attacked the police were charged with assault. Those who broke windows were accused of destroying government property. But from the start, the obstruction law was used by prosecutors to characterize an event that was harder to pin down: the ways in which rioters had disrupted the election certification. Sometimes prosecutors used the law against people who had made it all the way to the floor of the Senate, arguing that they played a direct role in chasing lawmakers from their duties. At other times, it was enough if defendants showed some sort of understanding that their actions had been meant to disrupt the certification process. Under the court's new ruling, however, prosecutors are likely to find it difficult to use the obstruction charge in future riot cases, unless, of course, they can show that defendants impaired or tampered with evidence during their time inside the Capitol. The prosecutors may turn to a different law for those who disrupted the democratic process that day: 18 U.S.C. 231, which makes it a crime to interfere with or impede law enforcement officers during a civil disorder. The main practical effect of the Supreme Court's ruling, lawyers who try these cases say, is that the Justice Department will have to re-sentence more than 100 people who have already been punished under the now invalid interpretation of the obstruction law. Some federal judges handling the cases have signaled that they are willing to increase the sentences defendants receive on crimes other than obstruction count in order to make up for any losses in prison time. Even as prosecutors have poured enormous time and energy into what are now more than 1,400 January 6th related cases, the attack on the Capitol has moved to the center of this year's presidential race, as both Mr. Trump and President Biden have focused on the assault. Both candidates have made an issue of Mr. Trump's indictments, ensuring that the federal charges he is facing in Washington related to his attempts to stay in power will be front and center as voters go to the poll. Still, even though 2 of the 4 charges in Mr. Trump's election case are based on obstruction law, the indictment may emerge from the Supreme Court's ruling largely unscathed. This is because prosecutors have effectively accused him of tampering with documents through his plot to create false slates of electors, claiming that he had won, in states that were actually won by Mr. Biden. The use of the obstruction charge would appear to be closer to the standards set by the Supreme Court. The justices will have much greater impact on Mr. Trump's case when they decide this week whether he's immune from election interference charges because they arose from actions he took as a president. That decision will be crucial in determining whether a jury will hear evidence that Mr. Trump tried to subvert the last election before voters consider returning him to power in the next one. And lastly today for you, I have an article here by Katie Mogg, and it's titled "Here to Help: How to Sleep Better in the Heat." Studies show that extreme heat can affect both how much you sleep and how good that sleep is, said Chat Milando, a research scientist at the Center for Climate and Health at the Boston University School of Public Health. When temperatures rise, it is essential to have a plan to keep cool while you sleep. How heat affects sleep. The body's core temperature drops during sleep, but hot environments can prevent it from properly cooling. Studies suggest that lower ambient temperatures signal to your body that it's time to rest. If your bedroom temperature is too high, it may be difficult to fall asleep, and you may wake up more often, said Dr. Michael Irwin, a professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences at the University of California, Los Angeles. To help your body regulate its temperature, your bedroom should ideally be between 65 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit, said Rebecca Robbins, an assistant professor of medicine in the sleep medicine division at Harvard Medical School. If it's far hotter, you may wake up throughout the night. Set yourself up for a good night's rest. There are steps you can take to sleep better during a heat wave, beyond just turning on the air conditioning, experts said. Sleeping well at night starts with staying hydrated and cool during the day. Drinking plenty of water ensures that your body has enough fluid to cool down. When you're dehydrated, you sweat less, and it becomes easier to overheat. You can keep your home cooler by closing your blinds and curtains, and keeping the air circulating in your bedroom can help. If you don't have an air conditioner, install a fan in an open window, which will help bring in the cooler air. To lower your body temperature before bed, place a damp rag on your forehead. The moisture in that rag is going to evaporate across the night. Avoid ice packs, experts say, since placing them on your skin for too long can damage the skin or cause frostbite. Dr. Robbins suggested sleeping under a thin top sheet, which can promote airflow. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from the June 30th issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Eric Jackson. Thank you for listening.
Radio Reading mails out a large print program schedule to our listeners every other month. If you have not received a Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service large print program schedule in the mail, please call us at 821-5555. We will make sure that you receive one every other month. Our number is 821-5555.
The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have a